Hello, and good day to everyone. My name is Paul Rosen, and I am the Executive Chairman of globalgo. And I wish to welcome everyone to today's webinar. Just a little bit about globalgo before we dive into today's program. globalgo provides consulting services to the global cannabis, hemp, and psychedelic industries. In tandem with strategic allies across the globe, globalgo serves clients throughout the world, from offices in Los Angeles, New York, Toronto, Johannesburg, London, Mexico City, Zurich, and Bogota. We're powered by a team of industry pioneers and world-class consultants. globalgo helps leading companies, funds, as well as fortune companies contemplating their entry point into the regulated cannabis industry, assess and enter new markets, acquire assets, raise capital, launch new product lines, improve SOPs, apply for licenses, comply with regulations, implement technology and security systems, and diagnose and execute solutions to growth obstacles. As we look to the future of cannabis and other plant-based industries, we are excited to support these industries and offer strategic, experience-based, best-in-class advisory. Now, today's webinar is free of charge, as always, but we do kindly request all attendees to consider making a donation of $100 to the Last Prisoners Project, an organization committed to bringing restorative justice to the cannabis industry. You can find a link to the Last Prisoners Project donation on our webinar form. Audience, before we get started, if you have any Q&A today, we would ask you to use the Q&A button rather than the chat feature so we can organize and respond to your questions quickly. All right, enough of the preamble. The topic of today's webinar is a Psychedelics Market Progress Report. Where are we and what's next? Now, as an early stage participant in the regulated cannabis industry, going back to 2012 in Canada, I must say I find this whole emerging industry of psychedelics absolutely fascinating. Growing up, I was drawn to psychedelics and read The Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley, Be Here Now by Ram Dass, The Psychedelic Experience by Timothy Leary, and Foods of the Gods by Terence McKenna, which whet my appetite. And I went on, when I was younger, many what we would now call macrodose trips. Cannabis, no doubt, has opened the door to a rediscovery of plant-based medications, and emerging psychedelics are quickly being accepted and embraced and normalized as unique tools for mental health practitioners serving patients in need of new therapies. At the same time, a commercial market has quickly formed, with hundreds of companies now raising capital and in some instances going public. I'll be frank in stating that this phenomena causes me both a great deal of hope and an equal amount of trepidation. Without further ado, let's get to today's webinar. To begin, I am so pleased to introduce my friend and my colleague, Richard Carleton, as our keynote speaker. Richard was appointed Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Securities Exchange in July 2011. During his tenure, Richard and the CSA team led a recapitalization of the exchange in 2012 and established relationships with key influencers in the Canadian securities industry and beyond. An early advocate for the cannabis industry, the CSE is now the global exchange leader in the listing of issuers in the cannabis space and has taken the lead on listing early stage psychedelic companies. Richard, thank you so much for participating. We look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's a real pleasure to introduce and to provide the keynote for today's webinar. And I want to thank the team at globalgo for the opportunity to introduce today's discussion. So one of the questions that I'm asked most often over the last few months from investors and from entrepreneurs and other people interested in the early stage public capital markets in Canada and beyond is the psychedelic space cannabis 2.0? Well, I think the panelists are going to talk a good deal about this question over the course of the next hour. And Paul is very, I think, insightful when he says that from his perspective as an early participant in the cannabis space, and of course the CSE's front door view on the development of the cannabis industry, I am both hopeful and also filled with a bit of trepidation as the psychedelics industry begins to emerge and mature. But I'll draw, I think, 2 points in which there are commonalities with the cannabis space, and then one that is, I think, demonstrates a big difference that investors and entrepreneurs and other people interested in the space should focus on. So like the cannabis space, we're actually blessed in the psychedelics arena to be working alongside a motivated group of visionaries, people who have risked their professional reputations and other perhaps opportunities in order to pursue the goal of advancing clinical research, science, if you will, into the study and a better understanding of the therapeutic benefit of psychedelic compounds on a variety of human health issues. They're around. We can see these people. They've been fighting for years to peel back some of the laws and regulations that have inhibited a better understanding and more insight into these particular compounds. And when we talk about it, and again, I've had the benefit of an early exposure to some of these leading practitioners in the space, but beginning to understand that there are powerful treatments for addiction, clinical depression, anxiety, PTSD, and other issues that are related to mental health that are feasible, or that there is anecdotal evidence or early clinical work that was done in the 20th century that was abandoned for a variety of reasons. And there is no doubt in North America, as we are in the grips of an opiate crisis, alcoholism, we know for sure that our addiction treatment, to be blunt, isn't very effective. We need new therapies. We need new treatment modalities. Depression, again, we have a multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical industry based on the treatment of depression, but success rates have been, I think, difficult to achieve. And we see so often these work that's being done that's very, very promising, where we can get build on the research that was done 50, 60, 70 years ago with some very, very positive preliminary indications. So we really are at the dawn of being able to advance clinical research using the FDA clinical trial process to get to a point where we have approved new treatment modalities overseen by medical professionals, which have the potential to have a profound influence on how we treat these various issues. So when we look at the market size, when we begin to think about, well, what is this going to mean? What is the business opportunity to bring it more into the market's context? Is it another cannabis? Well, no, it's not, in the sense that cannabis is a consumer packaged good. It needs to be thought of as such, whether it's additives for wellness or adult recreational use. We have a pretty good idea that of what the market size is and demand, consumer demand for these products, and areas where potentially it can build. So from that perspective, we have a good sense of where we're probably headed in the cannabis space. And the psychedelic space is substantially different. It's a pharmaceutical play. It's very tightly regulated. It's going to require a lot of clinical research. It's going to require a lot of investment from public and private sources in order to advance these compounds towards a therapeutic result, which is approved by the FDA. And there are going to be some challenges here, because in some respects, instead of, for example, if you're being treated for depression with psychedelics, you're going to go through a relatively short course of treatment under supervision of a medical professional. And if it's successful, if your neural pathways have been reoriented and some old behaviors and emotions and so on have been redirected, you may see if not permanent, but a long period of what you might call a cure. That's profoundly different than what you're seeing with present therapeutic approaches, which involve continuous consumption of a substance which is patent protected, generally speaking. So that will have profound differences as to how this industry develops, how it's funded, the strategies that companies need to employ, and investors, when they're looking at this market, need to be very careful in making assumptions that it's going to be just the same as the cannabis space, because it will be very, very different. And I think the panelists today, with their unique perspectives from different angles, will help, I think, explore the two themes that I've brought forward today. So with that, again, thank you to the Global Go team, and in particular to Paul Rosen for his kind words in the introduction. And I wish everybody a good webinar, and I look forward to sitting down on a fascinating conversation. Thank you, Paul.
Unmute. There we go. I was unmuted for a moment. Richard, thank you so much for your really insightful and probative comments. We appreciate all the great work you do on behalf of both industries, and we're delighted to see a fiduciary like yourself taking such a prominent role in the commercialization of this industry. I'm so excited to introduce the moderator for today's panel, who is Henry Sant Casilla, founding partner of the Conscious Fund, a psychedelic investment vehicle. In addition to co-founding the Conscious Fund, which does invest in early stage ventures in plant-powered medicine, Henry is also co-founder of Hive, the European Center of Excellence for Clinical Trials and Novel Therapeutics. He co-produces Microdose, the world's largest virtual psychedelic medicine conference, and actively advises companies in the psychedelic space on raising finance and their market entry. Henry's background is in law, and he began his career as a technology entrepreneur before working as a consultant in the supplements, pharmaceutical, and healthcare sectors. Without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce Henry to moderate today's panel.
Hi, Paul. Thank you very much. Very kind of you to introduce me. Enough about me, however. I'd very much like to introduce an excellent group of panelists. I'm just going to give you a very quick rundown of them so we maximise the time we can have a discussion. So first, I'd like to introduce a close friend of mine, Peyton Nyquist, who is chairman and CEO of Numinous. He's a former director, vice president, and head of sales at Mackey Research Capital. He's raised over $100 million for more than 100 public and private companies, and he founded Numinous after recognizing a gap in the healthcare system and out of a lifelong interest in health, wellness, and personal development. So welcome, Peyton. I'd also like to introduce David Wood, who is a partner at Borden Ladner Gervais. He is a lawyer and patent agent, holds a PhD in biochemistry, unusually, and he practices intellectual property and regulatory law. He's got a very strong background in cannabis, and he's translating that into the nascent psychedelic space. Next is Todd Shapiro, who may be familiar to you as a radio host. He is the co-founder, CEO, and director of Red Light Holland. He is an entrepreneur with over 20 years of experience and moved from mainstream media to concentrate on being the CEO of a psychedelic company. He's also a very big advocate for psychedelic medicine. And lastly, I'd like to introduce Josh Lawler, one of the nicest lawyers around the globe. His practice focuses on mergers and acquisitions, securities law, and technology transactions. He works in M&A with clients such as private equity groups, public and private companies, fundless sponsors, family offices, and sellers of large assets. And he and his firm are becoming increasingly active in the psychedelic medicine space. So it's a pleasure to introduce all the panelists. We've got 2 lawyers, 2 CEOs, so we should get a good debate going. I hope that we can keep kind of answers short and punchy, and we're going to come at this with the softball, easy question, which is what will it take to propel psychedelic medicine into the mainstream, either from a legal, a political, or a social and education perspective? And I will start with Josh, as he was on last in the introduction.
Well, I like that my best qualification is being a nice attorney. I think the social and education really has to lead it, especially in the United States. And I'm aware of your work with Hive, of course. I personally think that, in our country, the ketamine clinics, which provide a legal depression treatment alternative, are a great toehold, because I think that that's necessary to kind of counterbalance the natural comparison with cannabis, which, as was mentioned earlier, really is more of a consumer packaged good and not really all that much, mild overlap with the psychedelics. But I think we need to get out of the consumer packaged good kind of mentality on the psychedelics so that people can realize what they really are. And I think once it's realized what they really are, things should probably flow fairly, I won't say easily, but well, if you will.
Thank you, Josh. I'm going to throw that to Peyton to give us the perspective of a CEO that works in clinics. What are you hoping for to take this industry into the mainstream?
Yeah, I would agree with Josh. I think education is a huge needed component right now, especially as there's more and more interest coming into the space. A deeper education and understanding of what psychedelic therapy entails, even where the research is at, in particular to each molecule. And I think for the general public to get an education as well around how these therapies are being carried out and what needs to be around them in order for them really to be effective. These aren't panaceas, they're not magic pills, and need to be looked at as such, and a better education around the therapy itself as well.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to throw it to Todd, and I'm actually going to ask you two questions here. The first is from a media perspective. What needs to happen, assuming that we're right and we need more media attention on the space, what does the sector need to do to engage with the mainstream media?
Great question, and thank you very much for having me, by the way. And it's really nice to meet all the different panelists here. Really appreciate being on here and representing Red Light Holland. And I guess it's a great question on the media side. And ultimately, the media just sort of picks up on this stuff, I think, when they choose to. The way media works. One news sort of gets going across AP, and next thing you know, it's just like the news of the day. I don't think it's up to the media to decide when to do it. I think it's just up for the advocates, the pioneers, the companies going into the corporate space, and of course the individuals who are doing the medical and science and research, just to put out as much honest and genuine information out there. And let the media pick up on it naturally. I hope it's just not a news story or a trend. I hope ultimately what it is that learning and educational experience that we can share with the public, and the media will figure out when to do that. We all know there's a mental health crisis going on right now across the world, and I think we'd all be in agreement, whether it's recreationally or medically, that something needs to be done about it. Now, while we can't make medical claims there yet, I just think it's up to the responsibility of our great companies, great legal opinions behind us, to really put forth that message, and they'll find a way to do it, but I don't want it to be forced.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to you in just a second with the follow-on question, but I don't want to keep David out of it. David, could you maybe chime in with the kind of changes that you'd like to see to drive this into the mainstream, perhaps from a legal perspective?
I think the main change we might see is access outside of pharmaceuticals per se. But whether or not that happens, I echo and amplify what the other panelists said. Time is on our side. Education is only going to go in one direction with this. We just have to get past misinformation, drop our cultural baggage, and assess this psychedelics honestly, because it's compelling when you give it the chance and look at it. And I mean, a lot of people who stay out of trouble, so to speak, aren't going to give it a second thought because it's prohibited, and that's perfectly reasonable. I mean, it's a good thing. Most people think that way, but Unfortunately, we've been sold a bad bill of goods on this one. We've been given a false message, and time will cause that to dissipate. And education, or people's experiences or those of their loved ones, and just the reach of this information. And it's not a message, it's just information. You know, every Netflix special about it, or every Steve Jobs person who comes forward and says things about the impact psychedelics had on them, it's just going to snowball. And I think the snowball's getting a lot bigger now.
Thank you, David. It's very nice to see that your cat has joined the proceedings. Could you just maybe explain what you meant by access outside the pharmaceutical industry? What did you mean by that?
Well, I mean, Todd can talk to you all day about adult use as long as we keep it out of the fruiting bodies. But I'm thinking what Oregon has, right? That's a medical access system, a lot like what Canada has had since 2001 and continues to have, and a lot like many US states have. It's a system where you're accessing a therapeutic product despite the absence of regulatory approval for its sale as a drug. But it is a therapeutic product and it's being treated that way. And again, I just look to Oregon. That would be, if you're talking about a change in the law, that's the logical one to think of first.
Thank you. So just back to you, Todd. I'm just going to connect you back into what Josh said at the beginning. And that is a view which is quite common. It's very, certainly very common in the venture community. And that is that we've got to learn lessons from cannabis. We've got to do stuff differently. We'll be covering this topic in just a second. But something that Josh said earlier, which is we've got to get away from this consumer packaged goods mentality. Given what red light does, what would your response to Josh's comment be?
Yeah, I mean, clearly I would say I would have to disagree with that, but I think Josh would think that he'd be, and I hope you'd be proud on the way we're doing it as a company, meaning that we're only selling the truffles which are legal in the Netherlands in a microdose fashion. We only want to be corporately responsible from day one. We only want to be able, that's so cool. You're smoking a cigarette during the interview. That's unbelievable. I haven't seen that since like, okay, sorry. So it just threw me off. And we really just want to make sure that we educate and inform our consumers. A good example of that is we're working with a virtual reality company called Radix Motion right now. So we're developing virtual reality to put your mind into the space of a microdose that you'd actually put on a headset at a smart shop, put it on, make sure you feel comfortable with that experience before you buy our product. We really want to educate and inform those to do it responsibly as well. And quite frankly, I think you read all the anecdotal studies about microdosing, and I would say they're overwhelmingly positive. And that's the only way we would like to approach this for now, is to make sure it's an overwhelmingly positive experience. And by the way, one last thing, and I've heard this from scientists actually, where they've almost said that you're in a way providing people affordable medication, even though it's a recreational brand. And of course, I can't say that, we can't make those claims, but it's an interesting thing I've heard of.
Right. And just to clarify my statement, you know, when I said that, I really was thinking about it in the context of the cannabis recreational market more than I was thinking about it in the context of the CBD / cannabis medicinal market, therapeutic product market, which obviously are consumer goods, but I don't think that that's going to, in the United States, lead us in the direction towards the adoption. I think, you know, very much like cannabis in some ways, we're going to have it acknowledged as medicinal and prescribed, and at least in California, not necessarily Oregon, but at least in California, that's what it was to begin with. I mean, you know, you had to have a note from your doctor to get it. And we had that going for maybe 5 years. And possibly my experience is just because I've been in California and that's how we did it there. But certainly, you know, when you're in the area of kind of the microdose type of product, I don't know that that fits into that same recreational category, that I don't think that psychedelics are going to do well by making that the primary, you know, channel of you know, mass adoption, if that makes sense.
And that was a beautiful segue into the next topic, which is the lessons that we can learn from cannabis. I'm going to throw it to you, David. you've done a vast amount of work in cannabis. What do you think, kind of top level, we should learn from what's happened in the cannabis sector?
That if there's going to be a change in the law, well, from a legal perspective, there's going to be a change in the law. Think about why it's happening and understand the motives behind the legislative change, and then be consistent with those. But if you just mean from the perspective of participating in this market, I think one lesson we can definitely learn is to make sure that you're putting a company out there that offers real value. I mean, we've all heard different things about different companies that are at different levels of actually offering real value. And I think that's going to be even more important in this area. And I think one way that one can see that about a company is if its business plan is clear and focused. And much like the cannabis processors that are successful now, they have having a clear idea of what you're offering to the market as value and how you're going to make money is critical. So I would say that just focus in business goal and not spreading resources too thin.
Thank you. So Peyton, you're actually at the sort of center of the tornado on this. You are one of the earliest companies to go public. We've seen what's happened in public markets in cannabis. What's your kind of, top level lessons that you may have learned actually through operating Numinous? What would you like to see us learn?
Yeah, I would agree with David just in terms of clear business plan and strategy moving forward, adhering to that, sticking to it, and not trying to, I think you saw this early on in I call it the public market psychedelic space, where there was this rush of interest that came. Everybody was trying to figure out, what is it you're doing next week to bring value, and trying not to get caught up in the doing of something new every single week to try and keep interest, but really, continue to, we're talking about scalability. If you're talking about the difference or lessons that we can learn between cannabis and psychedelics, is you have to create a sustainable model around psychedelics so that you're actually providing access for people in a way that's going to stick and be supported, both regulatory wise and financially as well. So I think, again, I point back to the education piece as well. The more education there is out there around, even talking about different things like compassionate access, expanded access, the different, ways that this can be supported from a regulatory perspective, the more education that's out there, the better that's going to help, I think, educate, call it the market around, what they should be supporting and what their financial commitment is going to be supporting going forward.
Thank you. So I guess you're saying, both of you, it's sort of about discipline, really within the companies, and focus, rather than this very short-termist, new thing type thinking, which I guess grew out of the internet boom in 2000. So Todd, you are, forgive me if I'll say for saying this, you and your company are the closest that we've seen as an investment fund to an operation that's got kind of similarities with recreational cannabis outfits. You are at the kind of consumer end of things. What are your lessons that we should learn?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and one we focused on very carefully. And I really like what Peyton said, and it sounded like don't rush to create fluff. And to me, that was sort of, I think a lot of investors got angry within the cannabis industry, is really they were just putting out fluff news. I can tell you in our last corporate update, we have, as of a week ago, I guess we had $6.8 million in the bank. I'm not just putting out fluff to say we're doing something with that money. It doesn't mean I'm not being aggressive. It doesn't mean that I don't want to share news when I get it, but I'm not going to do it as much as there's anxious investors out there who want to see things, because we got to build a business here, a real business. And I'm doing my very best to grow a very real business with, of course, legalities, with market expansion, with getting opinions, working with the proper consultants. It takes time. Deals take time. And we're quite confident as a company that we're moving aggressively, like I said, but I'm not just going to throw out a news release just because it looks good for that day. And I think being fiscally responsible, treating your shareholders' money like it's your family's money. And by the way, in our case, really start small. We're starting in the Netherlands where we're allowed to start. We're not going to do what a lot of the cannabis companies did, which is we're going to grow X amount and we're going to throw it out to the world and everyone's going to use our product. That's not the way companies grow. You got to almost have case studies, beta studies, your guinea pig, so to speak, in a nice way, and make sure that the product connects, the brand connects, and then you can grow from there. And we're really excited to be doing that in a very careful way. And we're confident that it's still very early. You know, we have many years to go here, and you want positive cash flow. So you got to be careful on what your burn rate is and how you spend it.
Thank you. And that's actually a very good point, that the news flow is important. It's very important to investors. It's one of the things that attracts people, maintains stock prices. But if it's fluff, stuff pretty quickly starts to collapse. So what we'll do now is what I'd like to talk about is psychedelics from an investor perspective, not a professional investor like our fund. We've got, you know, facilities for due diligence. We've got connections throughout the market. But what I'd really like to look at is the kind of private investor that might invest through a listed company. And I'd like to throw this at Josh, and that is, what safeguards can investors take before entering this market, given your expertise in IP and regulations? What should they look for as kind of signs something might be a risk?
Sure. So, you know, I will say the initial cop-out answer that came to mind when you asked that question was don't do it. But putting that aside, you know, I do follow the space as a retail investor, and, you know, the first and foremost is team. And the reason for that is it's an integrity play. If you look at, you know, the public companies that are out there, and of course, you know, we just had the financial issue with Champagne, not to call them out necessarily, but it's the most recent example. I don't know that you can necessarily believe, whether it's intentional or not, anything that you are hearing if you are not actually in the industry and have some feel for what's going on. So, you know, if you must be there, the next best thing is to really dig deep on the people involved and to understand what their knowledge and motivation is. You know, whether they've been, you know, at this for 15 years trying to push molecules for particular purposes, whether they've got, you know, the appropriate backgrounds, or whether, you know, for lack of a better word, they're carpetbaggers. I think, you know, the industry itself has got a very big difference in cannabis, in that I don't think we're going to get a Canopy Growth Constellation Brands moment, because there's not this massive, you know, black market, if you will, with, you know, billions of dollars of market already happening, where Constellation sits there and goes, this could happen, and we've got a giant global distribution network, so we're going to pump $3 billion or whatever it was into Canopy Growth, thereby setting off, you know, this wave of just, you know, in hindsight, rather ridiculous euphoria. I don't think that's going to happen in this space. The pharmaceutical industry is a lot more reserved. The true recreational market is not really, I think, where it's pointed at, as distinguished from the microdose market, Todd. But the microdose market is kind of, it's a supplement market, which is a huge market, of course. But, you know, you're dealing in nootropics, which is a very specific and smaller section of that market. So, you know, I think what you've got right now for the retail investor is, don't think it's cannabis. That's like my giant advice, is don't think it's cannabis. If, you know, if you want to get into it for reasons, and honestly, I think the best reason to get into it is that you've got the money that you can do something with, and you believe in the philosophy of what's happening. At that point, you know, by all means, you know, jump in with something that's manageable, and look at team. And, you know, that's kind of my thoughts.
Thank you. You've unwittingly advised people to invest through a fund. So thank you for that cautionary advice at the beginning. Peyton, you've seen this at first hand. You are obviously going to start to see other clinic groups listing or looking for investors. What would your view of your advice to a retail investor be?
I'm continuing to poke to what other good people are saying, but I agree with Josh around team, and I think, you know, looking at what's informing the model, and how you're putting that model together, and is it very clear in terms of You know, you can go race out. I think it's interesting. There's lots of groups talking about going out and acquiring 100 clinics by next week. And, you know, that's, if anybody who's gone through an acquiring clinic process realizes it's a big body of work, and ultimately where the focus needs to be from a clinic perspective is on the outcomes of the people coming through those clinics, not, you know, how many you've got in your portfolio and what it is that you're trying to crank out. But this is you know, what excites me a lot about this category is it's going to be driven by the outcomes of people going through the treatment. And I think that that's really important, to always be really anchored in what it is that you're doing. And so, you know, the conversation around other groups going out and setting up clinics, you know, it's interesting. People always ask, you know, what does the competitive landscape look like? And I sort of laugh when I hear that, because that means what we're doing is working, and there's access being provided for people, which is ultimately what's important in the name of the game. But I think, you know, it's so early. I think there's tons of space for data sharing and resource sharing and information sharing to really, you know, this is going to take a lot of oars in the water paddling in the same direction to make sure that this gets done properly and supported in a way that is sustainable and lasting. So that, you know, if I go back to other groups in the space, I would say pick up the phone and call around and talk to people and bring on people who have, you know, a real deep understanding of this category.
I think that's a very good point that you made about patients, and that is actually one of the criteria that we use as a fund. Is we look for companies that are patient focused rather than quick return focus. That's a very, very key ethos that's got to be built into both the team and the plan and the model of the companies that we look to invest in. David, you've popped onto the screen as the largest screen, so I'm going to direct this at you. How would you advise investors? And if you could touch a little bit on how people can investigate IP claims, I think that would be very helpful, because that is one of the key topics in the industry, is IP.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And that's absolutely true. Another big point of distinction from cannabis is that since this starts as pharmaceuticals only, IP is critical. You're investing in a junior stage pharmaceutical company. If you're investing in a company that makes or is intending to make, and I say make, that's a bad verb, bring a product to market, to sponsor clinical trials and to own the rights to the products that will result from those trials. If that's what you're investing in, then intellectual property is the primary asset. The secondary asset is the regulatory approval, unless you're investing in a company that's commercializing classical psychedelics like LSD, psilocybin, and MDMA, or you're investing in a company that's commercializing ones that we might not call classical psychedelics, but are known, like phenethylamines that are not MDMA or other common ones like 2CB or other drugs that are in, I guess, the book PyCal. You know, those things can't be patented either, but there's also no safety data, or much less safety data on them than the other ones. So you want to think about, in those cases, how the regulatory approval is going to be valuable, but in the absence of intellectual property rights on the compound itself. You can then look at whether they have intellectual property rights on other aspects of the supply chain, and you can look at whether they have intellectual property rights on delivery systems that could result in patents that apply to products, even if they don't apply to the payload specifically. And then also just recognizing that that's not the only type of company here. And companies that are, as other panelists have pointed out, like there's a therapy is a big part of this, and that's going to change the economics of the whole supply chain. I can't remember who said it. I think it might have been Richard during the opening, but this isn't about taking pills every day and going through hundreds and hundreds of dollars worth of pills every month. It's about taking tablets, I should call them, less frequently and with a psychotherapist. And since a bigger chunk of that revenue stream is psychotherapy, you want to think about whether there's intellectual property there. And that might look more like software or processes or ways of running a clinic, because we have healthcare practitioners who are going to practice from the clinics, but we also have clinic management companies that are very good at what they do. And I think we're going to see, well, I mean, Peyton can talk about this for sure, with, you know, how you make an MDMA clinic that follows the MAPS protocol, how you make a psilocybin clinic that follows the Compass protocol, how the Janssen journey works, all those things. There's going to be clinics that are good at this, and that's going to be another segment people can invest in, where, you know, branding and kind of, let's say, procedural or soft IP would be, which is different than branding, that's trademarks, but, you know-how and copyright and computer software, just ways of running a business and franchising, that could be valuable too. So I guess it'd be all that to say, invest in what you know, as always, look at the team, and then with IP, just understand the context that it's important for, which is very different for different kinds of companies.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you. So Todd, when I first met you, you were raising a seed round, and in what seemed like minutes, you'd gone public. So you've seen this in terms of attracting private investors, typically larger people like our fund, but there were some probably retail people in that mix, and then you went public. What would your advice be for that, perhaps for the type of retail investor that's backed Red Light?
Well, it's got to start with the trust and a belief in what you're pitching people. And it's interesting because, you know, Josh brought up about how you got to really believe in the team. And listen, I'm a rookie CEO in the capital markets. I'm the first to admit that. I've only really learned about psychedelics over the last couple of years. I never tried to BS any new investor to my company that I'm this big, huge advocate and been doing it for a decade. And no, I've been reading books and watching documentaries and heard people on Joe Rogan, of course. But I had a personal belief in it, because back to the mental health crisis, I just seen too many people being affected and not being helped. And anecdotally, I read and studied and knew people who were being helped by microdosing. And quite frankly, I think all of us on the panel right here today probably know people who microdose. And I guess as a company, we say, listen, they're most likely microdosing through these illegal sites and getting it, whether it's in Vancouver and ordering it to all different nations across the world. And we're very proud as a company now that we have this first order of 10,000 units anticipated to be on shelves and through an online platform in September, to say that as a publicly traded company, we're selling a legal microdose. Like, we're very proud of that. So that's what I originally sort of pitched on people. And now we're delivering on that action. And I surrounded myself around incredible people on our management team. Josh, you also mentioned Canopy Growth earlier. Bruce Linton's the chair of our advisory board. There's a reason for it. He recognized that there could be a path to profitability here. It wasn't just fluff, that if we delivered on what we were saying we were going to do, we could create an actual company with revenues. And that's what we're aiming to do, obviously. And there's amazing people behind me as well. Ann Barnes was one of the co-founders of Peace Naturals. They had the first medical license in Canada. She's on our board of directors. This type of experience has really been amazing to me. I love being a coachable CEO, and I love the fact that our investors, who especially came in on that seed round and then maybe have bought us on the open market, recognize that, listen, this is a team and this is about a future. And if you put a good team and then you can deliver on what their future we all think is going to be, then we'll be, I really believe we'll be in amazing shape.
So I guess the most common answer here from all of you is the team, the people, the ethos. These are relatively straightforward things to look at, or you can do what David does, which requires kind of legal rocket science, and really look under the hood at IP and regulatory issues. So there's actually a lot for investors to look at in this market before making a decision. Before we go to the Q&A, we've got about 4 minutes left. I'm actually just going to throw you each an individual question from my own interest, and hopefully the audience will find this interesting. I'll start with you, Peyton. Most clinic operators are working in ketamine. It's the sort of low-hanging fruit in the psychedelics world. What time frame do you think we are in for seeing more exotic psychedelics like psilocybin, dimethyltryptamine, MDMA? what kind of time frame are we looking at to see those being offered in clinics in the US or Canada?
Yeah, that's probably the most asked and most impossible question to answer. You know, notwithstanding the fact that we're in the middle of COVID-19 and all of the wrinkles that that brings to the table as well. But I think you've seen, you know, MAPS has done an incredible job with MDMA and starting to, they've now got expanded access sites in the US, starting to be able to start providing MDMA assisted psychotherapy for post-traumatic stress disorder. Psilocybin, you know, whether it's Heptar Usona, Compass, there's a huge amount of work being done to be able to start provide that therapy in clinic as well. We're very interested in the compassionate access and expanded access model in Canada and in the US, and what levers can be pulled there. And that's where our focus has been, is start to get something into practice in a supported way, where we're working with regulators to be able to build out what that model could potentially look like. I'm hesitant to give a date, but I think, you know, you could potentially see something towards the end of before the end of the year. And I think as you see more and more interest and more resources come to the space that are well intentioned, that's only going to continue to fuel that, and hopefully we see something sooner than later. And I think the other thing that not that you ever want to play opportunist of this situation, but one of the things not that COVID has done is continued to shine a brighter and brighter spotlight on how we're treating mental health and how we need to be looking at it differently. And I think if there's something that could potentially be good that comes of that, is a real reinforcement of needing to bring some new therapies to light that could help with this mental health issue that we're having right now and continue to have.
Thank you very much. Josh, I'm going to come over to you and combine my question with a question from Dr. Lindsay Moore, who's in the audience. Dr. Moore's question is, in the US, what are some of the legal issues? And my refinement of that is, could you summarize the difference between the Canadian and American approach to the law in psychedelics?
Well, I mean, to state the obvious, it's a Schedule I prohibited substance in the United States. At least as far as psilocybin goes, it is. You know, Canada has been ahead of us by, I guess, you know, 2 or 3 years at least, on a pretty consistent basis. And, you know, quite honestly, I'm not going to get too far into that because it's not Canadian law is not my focus. We have somebody else on the panel who focuses on that much more than I do, certainly. But, you know, in the US, it's really, and in so many ways right now, the United States is a very divided country, I guess, in terms of the popular kind of culture and beliefs and all of that type of thing. And, you know, we still have a hangover of the just say no kind of era, if you will, that I think may be very much unique to our country as far as I know it. I think that the hallucinogenics, a lot of them really were swept up in that unfairly, you know, and based on my own experiences, which we won't go into, I mean, the motivations behind making those illegal are very different than the motivations behind making many other substances that are on the same schedule illegal. So, you know, that is, I think, the largest difference. And, you know, again, as we've been saying all along, that's why recreational is not the direction to go into to get it set. That's why, you know, as Peyton's been mentioning, the compassionate care model, which has worked with us with cannabis, the clinical model where, you know, these are treated as supervised prescription pharmaceuticals. You know, there's possibilities there. There's solid possibilities there. You know, one of the things that I think we haven't mentioned, but in the United States is a very big factor, is that, you know, there's a huge government interest in terms of treating PTSD and depression. You know, one thing we have that Canada does not have is a giant military that's extremely active and results in veterans who have otherwise fairly untreatable issues, at least as far as I understand it. So there's a pressure there that is, I think, very positive in terms of getting the government to swing around in the right direction. So hopefully that answers the question. I mean, it's really more.
It does, yes. It's a beautiful answer for a very difficult request to praise seal that law. David, just crossing over to you, it may help the audience if you're able to summarize the situation in Canada. And my question around that would be, why is Canada so much more advanced? What has enabled it to take that leading position in the space? I think you're muted, David.
I was, thank you. Yes, my apologies. So I think there's a number of reasons why. And one reason, however different they might be, is the fact that we have regulated cannabis as a CPG. That just makes the discussion easier. It's going to be less politically challenging. And it's just going to create a easier environment to operate in terms of getting employees who aren't worried about their reputations, in terms of getting dealers' licenses. The mechanism to work with restricted drugs, which all psychedelics, or more or less all of them, depending on how you define them, are within, not ketamine. Ketamine's a narcotic because it's medically useful, but restricted drugs, which have no medical use, working with those means you need a license, and the decision to grant that license is going to be governed by policy at the Office of Controlled Substances. The rules aren't that different from the United States. I just think it's the regulators' willingness to allow this work to happen and the willingness of academics to get involved in it without reputational risk. I mean, the number of times I've heard David Nichols comment on YouTube videos I've watched that if you wanted to ruin your career as an academic, just say you want to work with psychedelics. You know, that used to be how it was. And I think that attitude is just shifting in Canada more quickly. And I think regulated cannabis, for right or wrong, is a part of why. And then I think also, and I mean, we've regulated cannabis at the federal level. We clearly just have a less intense approach to drug prohibition than the United States. I'm 42. I remember just saying no, and it worked. I was as terrified of drugs as I was of communists. But I think Canada just has brought that around a little. When I saw footage of Chernobyl, I was surprised they weren't wearing jackboots. Like, I really, really didn't, you know, propaganda works on people.
Thank you. Thank you. Excellent. I'm going to just...
do you mind if I add to that real quick?
Yeah, sure.
Because I think it's something that it's important to bring up is social movements. And really how social movements are so effective these days. We watch them and we watch them make change and expedite that change quite rapidly. And I think, and I really believe this, that when it comes to responsible use of psilocybin and others I don't know as well, quite frankly, you're going to see social movements demanding at least natural plant-based, fungi-based medicines. And you're going to see that happen overnight, which is going to force governments to make change quicker than later. And we're going to see it across the world. Back to mental health. People don't want to get on opioids. They don't want these prescribed medicines from big pharma. They're watching it tear their families apart. They're going to want natural solutions that can help. And we think that's going to happen quicker, you know, again, sooner rather than later, because of how educated and really, again, responsible use is the most important thing. You would never tell someone to take 20 Tylenols in a cabinet. Why the hell would you tell them to take, you know, 50 grams of something, at least if it, you know, if it wasn't a guided therapy session? So it's about responsible use, and these social movements, I think, will make a difference.
Thank you. I'm going to be cheeky here and just very quickly answer a couple of audience questions myself, just for speed. The first one is from Mario Pinzon, who asks, does anybody have an MVP in psychedelics? And the answer to that is you're looking at two of them. Peyton has a clinic company that's operating. Todd has a company that sells microdosing products, and I run a fund which you're welcome to invest into. The second one was from Patrick McCartan, which is asking about sustainability. It's not a huge topic. There is, many companies have got social programs for social sustainability and patient access. For example, as a fund, we donate 5% of our profits to those kind of causes. Many companies will do the same. And in terms of environmental impact, ibogaine is the hot button topic there, because that's very difficult to grow and does have a very severe environmental impact where it's cropped. So just a final question, and I'm going to have to throw this out to all of you. It's a very perceptive question from Oleg Feldgaja. I hope I pronounced that correctly. It's a long question, so I'm going to proceed it. And that is, one of the problems in Cannabis 1.0 was companies going public unprotected, as he puts it, so that there were big capital markets players manipulating markets, and that left the majority of the investors very vulnerable. Is there a way that the CSE or other stock markets can protect public companies in the cannabis space from being vulnerable to those sort of big player antics? I don't know if anyone would like to take that hot potato. Josh, you're smiling.
Yeah, well, I mean, the cynical answer is no. You know, the reality of the situation is that if you've got a thinly traded public equity, it's subject to manipulation. And, you know, quite honestly, that can be legal manipulation, in the sense that if, you know, the proverbial whale is aware that there's a thinly traded company in a space that's got, you know, the type of kind of attention that psychedelics has, that if they go and they buy 100,000 shares of something, it's going to drive the price up, and then other people will jump in and they can go sell 100,000 shares. And that's just kind of a fact of life, subject to certain things here and there in terms of reporting and percentages that I won't get into because it's all legal technicalities. But nonetheless, there's not a protection there. You know, the law is not designed there. There's protection from, you know, false information getting out there, the pump and dump, if you will. But I don't think that that's necessarily where people are getting smacked in this space, or the cannabis space, for that matter. You know, you hate to be paternalistic about it, but the fact is that, you know, there are people who don't do their diligence and just jump on via, you know, excitement and momentum. And there are other people who are much larger who take advantage of that. And, you know, that's an issue, but I don't know how to solve it.
Thank you. Peyton, just very quickly, because I know that you've served on various public market type boards, what would your solution to this be?
Yeah, I think you could probably have a whole nother panel just about this discussion, and especially around the Canadian capital markets in particular. I think it's interesting, some of the recent things you've seen, the OSC talking about changing some of the short rules in Canada, which, you know, there's rules in the US that you go to jail for that are regular practice in Canada. And I think that needs to change. And especially if you're talking about bringing on US investment, we had a lot of folks from the United States finance or come into some of our first financings, and they were scratching their heads seeing some of the antics that go on in Canada. And you know, talking about cannabis, a lot of that was really highlighted in the cannabis space in Canada, as there was so much interest and so much investment that poured into that space. And you know, this is a long game. This is a very in order to support this properly, this is going to take a long time. It's going to take investment, and it's going to take a lot of hard work. And you know, I think regulators have to look at what gets done in the capital market space, and there needs to be some changes. And as I mentioned, especially around some of the trading rules and short trading rules, and just to make it a level and fair playing field for the retail investor who's coming in and just wanting to support and make an investment in the space. It needs to be fair.
Thank you. I know we haven't got much time left. I assume I'm going to get cut off, but I'm just going to throw that at David and Todd. David, do you want to just have a quick crack at that, and then we'll move over to Todd and we'll finish up?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm sorry, I lost sight of the question. I was listening to,
it's what protections can public exchanges put in place to protect retail investors from large market players and things like shorts and kind of manipulative trading and things like that?
you know, I'm really the wrong person to ask this guy. That's
Okay.
far outside my expertise, and that's why I work at a firm with other practitioners.
Todd, do you want to quickly touch on that?
Sure, and I always call myself the retail investor, even though I'm the CEO of a company now that's publicly traded. I was a retail guy. I got lucky a bit on a bull cannabis run for sure, and you know, started to sense some valuations were way out of whack, and you know, luckily, you know, got out of some positions probably at the right time. And I would say, and I think Peyton would probably agree, is like, again, look to transparent CEOs, give them a call. Like, their best protections are the people you can talk to. Inquire, call me up. You know, I found that I get amazing emails and phone calls from first emergency responders, those who have post-traumatic stress disorder, who are interested in the product beyond just the capital markets, interested really what our plans are. And then you look to a fair valuation. I did a raise at 6 cents. Did we come out of the gate flying hot? Peyton will tell you the same. The sector was hot, the hype was there. And sometimes as CEO of a company, you obviously want your stock to go as high as it can. You want everybody to do well, but you want it to be in line with what you're doing, I think, because then the expectations are managed. And we, quite frankly, are very excited by the future and managing those expectations carefully. And don't get me wrong, you want hype in a sector. You look at the hype that's going on in Tesla. It's an overvalued stock. We all know that, but there's a community there. And I think for Peyton's company or for my company, if you get a strong community of believers that want to hold on to your vision and let you deliver it, I think, you know, I can't ever give financial advice, but I would strongly say to people that if you believe in the vision of a team and what they can deliver on, then I think no matter where you're at, you know, those are your protections you could put into place, your belief and the trust in the management.
Yeah, although just to counterpoint that and be the lawyer with the wet blanket here, you know, we would advise all of our clients who are CEOs of companies who receive phone calls asking for what the company is doing to refer somebody to the very scrubbed web page that we have previously looked at to make sure that there's no inside information. Because, you know, you've got to worry about insider trading when you start talking with people.
Well, but no, I would never encourage anyone to buy a stock, and I made that very clear. I just said,
you know, I get it, and I'm not trying to personally.
And by the way, filing on CEDAR, you know, filing all your work, and people can go look at everything that you filed. That's obviously the most important thing. It's not just a quick investment. Go and do that due diligence, 100%. But I would never ever encourage anybody. I said I can't give financial advice. I think though, if you can trust a management team and then they deliver or say, well, you know, for instance, us. We have a product that's going to be on shelves. We're anticipating September. We're ahead of our schedule, what we pitched investors. We're quite proud of that. That's delivering, you know, that's what I would say.
Right. Yes. Cedar is good. Post it all on Cedar.
Thank you. We've overrun slightly. It's been very enjoyable. It's been good to get into so much depth. So I'd like to thank Todd, David, Peyton, and Josh for all their input during this panel. And I will hand it back for the next segment.
I think that'll be me. Hey guys, Paul here again. That was absolutely fascinating. A diverse range of opinions. It's not lost on me that this panel is not demographically diverse, and that's something at GlobalGo we obviously strongly believe in. We look forward to seeing more diversity in the emerging psychedelic industry, mirroring the diversity that is sweeping and in profound and important way across the broader economy. I'm optimistic from what I heard today. I was a participant in a lot of the early stage cannabis companies that may be overpromised and underdelivered. And I'm also familiar with a lot of the hedge funds and other asymmetrical investment vehicles in Canada that have a sort of a strategy to play these stocks in the short term. And that's part of what a market does. Like the buyer beware, caveat emptor is good advice for an investor. And I think it's fair to say that the people leading some of these emerging psychedelic companies are well-intentioned and are hard at work to build a company that will have long-term value, promote patient welfare, and hopefully improve society at large. And that's great. And we also have to recognize that for a lot of people, it's a trade. and it's a trade that they can move in and move out of quickly. And that's just the nature of capital markets. We have to sort of find the right triangulation to make sure that individual investors are protected while there's still a liquid market available for those that wish to buy in and buy out. This has been fascinating. I think that we are very early on in not the psychedelic industry. Psychedelics go back millennia, but in sort of what we'll call a 2.0, a reset. And I'm encouraged by the solemnity and the mission of purpose by all the people on today's webinar that our industry is being stewarded by some really responsible fiduciaries, from Richard Carleton all the way down to the operators. So a lot of reasons to be optimistic and to pay close attention to this emerging industry. Hey, I want to thank everyone for taking time out of their busy schedules today to attend today's event. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank our sponsors as well. Zuber, Lawler, Del Duca, Josh, there's a shout out to you, CFN Media, Flower Hire, Canamerks, Good AM Ventures, and Last Prisoners Project, as I mentioned at the beginning, and I will circle back at the end. This is a free webinar, but we do encourage people that have the ability to make a donation to Last Prisoners Project to bring much needed and long overdue restorative justice to the victims of the same war on drugs that we're all participating in as a commercial enterprise. Until next time, this is Paul Rosen, the Executive Chairman of globalgo. Be well, God bless, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.